Good afternoon. Good afternoon. For some reason, the chat seems to be disconnected here. I don't know why. So I'm going to just leave a message on that. Okay. Well, in any case, we will proceed. So today I'm going to read from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. But one of the critical quotes that comes from this book comes from chapter 5. So I'm going to begin today based on that quote, and then I'm going to go back to chapter 3, which is the position of the West on the question of religion. But there's one quote that's very important for us today in terms of understanding ourselves and our country. And that is that if we have a neurotic situation in ourselves or our country, we are mentally ill and we're not well suited to survive in society, whether it's the society of human beings or the society of nations. And so I'm going to just give you a quick summary of that situation. This comes from chapter 5 of The Undiscovered Self. The rupture between faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness, which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day. It is as if two different persons were making statements about the same thing, each from his own point of view, or as if one person in two different frames of mind were sketching a picture of his experience. If for person we substitute modern society, it is evident that the latter is suffering from a mental dissociation, i.e., a neurotic disturbance. In view of this, it does not help matters at all if one party pulls obstinately to the right and the other to the left. This is what happens in every neurotic psyche, to its own deep distress. And it is just this distress that brings the patient to the doctor. As I stated above in all brevity, while not neglecting to mention certain practical details whose omission might have perplexed the reader, the doctor has to establish a relationship with both halves of his patient's personality, because only from them both, and not merely from one half with the suppression of the other, can he put together a whole and complete man. So I would just say that that's true of nations as well as men, and so we ought to evaluate our politicians based on who is trying to unite the country and who is trying to divide the country, because a divided country is a weak country. And so I'll leave it at that for the moment, and I'm going to reemphasize that particular quote in several other readings this week. But I'm going to now, at this point, I'm going to be reading from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung, Chapter 3, The Position of the West on the Question of Religion. Now, it's to be remembered that Dr. Jung was writing this in the mid-1950s, so the political situation was a bit different from what it is today, and he was facing the Iron Curtain. We no longer have the Iron Curtain, but we still have issues. And I'm just going to try to get this chat going again. I don't know why the chat is not functional. Okay, I'm going to leave it that we will not have chat in this reading. I regret that, but that seems to be a problem within YouTube. All right, so this is Chapter 3, The Position of the West on the Question of Religion. Considering this development in the 20th century of our Christian era, the Western world stands with its heritage of Roman law, the treasures of Judeo-Christian ethics grounded on metaphysics, and its ideal of the inalienable rights of man. Anxiously, it asks itself the question, how can this development be brought to a standstill and put into reverse? It is useless to pillory the socialist dictatorship as utopian or to condemn its economic principles as unreasonable, because, in the first place, the criticizing West has only itself to talk to, its arguments being heard only on this side of the Iron Curtain, and, in the second place, any economic principles you like can be put into practice so long as you are prepared to accept the sacrifices they entail. You can carry through any social and economic reforms you please if, like Stalin, you let 3 million peasants starve to death and have a few million unpaid laborers at your disposal. A state of this kind has no social or economic crises to fear, so long as its power is intact, that is to say, so long as there is a well-disciplined and well-fed police army in the offing. It can maintain its existence for an indefinitely long period and can go on increasing its power to an indefinite extent. In accordance with its excess birth rate, it can raise the number of its unpaid workers almost at will in order to compete with its rivals, regardless of the world market, which is to a large measure dependent on wages. The real danger can come to it only from outside, through the threat of military attack. But this risk grows less every day. But this risk grows less every year, firstly because the war potential of the dictator states is steadily increasing, and secondly because the West cannot afford to arouse latent Russian and Chinese nationalism and chauvinism by an attack which would divert their well-meant undertakings into a hopelessly wrong channel. So far as one can see, only one possibility remains, and that is a breakdown of power from within, which must, however, be left to follow its own inner development. Any support from outside at present would have little effect in view of the existing security measures and the danger of nationalistic reactions. The absolute state has an army of fanatical missionaries to do its bidding in matters of foreign policy, and these in their turn can count on a fifth column who are guaranteed asylum under the laws and constitution of the Western states. In addition, the communes of believers, very strong in places, considerably weaken Western government's powers of decision, whereas the West has no opportunity to exert a similar influence on our rivals, though we are probably not wrong in surmising that there is a certain amount of opposition among the masses in the East. There are always upright and truth-loving people to whom lying and tyranny are hateful. but one cannot judge whether they exert any decisive influence on the masses under the police regimes. There's a footnote. Recent events in Poland and Hungary have shown that this opposition is more considerable than could have been foreseen. And I would just add to this is a reference to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and it also would apply to the former Soviet Union, which collapsed of its own weight in 1989. In view of this uncomfortable situation, the question is heard again and again in the West: what can we do to counter this threat from the East, even though the West has considerable industrial power and a sizable defense potential at its sizable defense potential at its command? We cannot rest content with this, for we know that even the biggest guns and the heaviest industry with its relatively high living standard are not enough to check the psychic infection spread by religious fanaticism. The West has unfortunately not yet awakened to the fact that our appeal to idealism and reason and other desirable virtues, delivered with so much enthusiasm, is mere sound and fury. It is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. We are faced not with a situation that can be overcome by rational and moral arguments, but with an unleashing of emotional forces and ideas engendered by the spirit of the times, and these, as we know from experience, are not much influenced by rational reflection, and still less by moral exhortation. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmac, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. Unhappily, the little word should, which never fails to appear in this connection, points to a certain weakness, if not the absence of the desideratum. Not only does the West lack a uniform faith that could block the progress of a fanatical ideology, but as the father of Marxist philosophy, it makes use of exactly the same spiritual assumptions, the same arguments and aims. Although the churches in the West enjoy full freedom, they are not less full or empty than in the East. Yet they exercise no noticeable influence on the broad course of politics. The disadvantage of a creed as a public institution is that it serves two masters. On the one hand, it derives its existence from the relationship of man to God, and on the other hand, it owes a duty to the state, i.e., to the world, in which connection it can appeal to the saying, "Render unto Caesar," and various other admonitions of the New Testament. In early times, and until comparatively recently, there was, therefore, talk of power ordained by God. Romans 13:1. Today, this conception is antiquated. The churches stand for traditional and collective convictions, which in the case of many of their adherents are no longer based on their own inner experience, but on unreflecting belief, which is notoriously apt to disappear as soon as one begins thinking about it. The content of belief, then, comes into collision with knowledge. and it often turns out that the irrationality of the former is no match for the ratiocinations of the latter. Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience, and where this is absent, even a strong faith which miraculously as a gift of grace may depart equally miraculously. I'm going to reread this sentence. Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience, and where this is absent, even a strong faith which came miraculously as a gift of grace may depart equally miraculously. People call faith the true religious experience, but they do not stop to think what actually it is. But they do not stop to think that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happened to us in the first place, which instilled trust and loyalty. This experience has a definite content that can be interpreted in terms of one or other of the denominated creeds. But the more this is so, the more the possibilities of these conflicts with knowledge mount up, which in themselves are quite pointless. That is to say, the standpoint of the creeds is archaic. They are full of impressive mythological symbolism, which, if taken literally, comes into insufferable conflict with knowledge. But if, for instance, the statement that Christ rose from the dead is to be understood not literally but symbolically, then it is capable of various interpretations that do not collide with knowledge and do not impair the meaning of the statement. The objection that understanding it symbolically puts an end to the Christian's hope of immortality is invalid, because long before the coming of Christianity, mankind believed in a life after death and therefore had no need of the Easter event as a guarantee of immortality. The danger that a mythology understood too literally and as taught by the Church will suddenly be repudiated lock, stock, and barrel is today greater than ever. Is it not time that the Christian mythology, instead of being wiped out, was understood symbolically for once? It is still too early to say what might be the consequences of a general recognition of the fatal parallelism between the state religion of the Marxists and the state religion of the Church. The absolutist claim of a civitas Dei, represented by man, bears an unfortunate resemblance to the divinity of the state, and the moral conclusion drawn by Ignatius Loyola from the authority of the Church, the end sanctifies the means, anticipates the lie as a political instrument in an exceedingly dangerous way. Both demand unqualified submission to faith and thus curtail men's freedom, the one his freedom before God and the other his freedom before the state, thereby digging the grave for the individual. The fragile existence of the individual, the unique carrier of life, is threatened on both sides, despite their respective promises of spiritual and material idols to come. And how many of us can, in the long run, fight against the proverbial wisdom of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush? Besides which, the West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical leveling down tendency and materialistic aims, as the state religion of the Eastern Bloc, as I have explained above. What then has the West, with its political and denominational schisms, to offer to modern man in his need? Nothing, unfortunately, except a variety of paths, all leading to one goal, which is practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal. I'll read that question and answer once again. What then has the West, with its political and denominational schisms, to offer to modern man in his need? Nothing, unfortunately, except a variety of paths, all leading to one goal, which is practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal. It requires no special effort of understanding to see where the communist ideology gets the certainty of its belief that time is on its side and that the world is ripe for conversion. The facts speak a language that is all too plain in this respect. It will not help us in the West to shut our eyes to this and not recognize our fatal vulnerability. Anyone who has once learned to submit absolutely to a collective belief and to renounce his eternal right to freedom and the equally eternal duty of individual responsibility will persist in this attitude and will be able to set out with the same credulity, the same lack of criticism in the reverse direction, if another and manifestly better belief is foisted upon his alleged idealism. What happened not so long ago to a civilized European nation, we accuse the Germans of having forgotten it all again already, but the truth is that we don't know for certain whether something similar might not happen elsewhere. It would not be surprising if it did, and if another civilized nation succumbed to the infection of a uniform and one-sided ideal. America, which forms the real political backbone of Western Europe, seems to be immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted, but in point of fact she is perhaps even more vulnerable than Europe, since her educational system is the more influenced by the scientific. Weltanschauung, with its statistical truths and her mixed population, finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. I feel that sentence is wrong and marked it so in the margin, so I'll talk about that in a minute. The historical and humanistic type of education so sorely needed in such circumstances leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella existence. Though Europe possesses this latter requirement, she uses it to her own undoing in the form of nationalistic egoisms and paralyzing skepticism. Common to both is the materialistic and collectivistic goal, and both lack the very thing that expresses and grips the whole man, namely an idea that puts the individual human being in the center as the measure of all things. This idea alone is enough to arouse the most violent doubts and resistances on all sides, and one could almost go so far as to assert that the valuelessness of the individual in comparison with large numbers is the one belief that meets universal and unanimous assent. To be sure, we We all say that this is the century of the common man, that he is the Lord of the earth, the air, and the water, and that on his decision hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion only. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion only, and is counterbalanced by a reality which is very different. In this reality, man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of the war technique, which is supposed to safeguard his physical existence. His spiritual and moral freedom, though guaranteed within limits in one half of the world, is threatened with chaotic disorientation, and in the other half it is abolished altogether. Finally, to add comedy to tragedy, this lord of the elements, this universal arbiter, hugs to his bosom notions which stamp his dignity as worthless and turn his autonomy into an absurdity. All his achievements and possessions do not make him bigger. On the contrary, they diminish him, as the fate of the factory worker under the rule of a just distribution of goods clearly demonstrates. Okay, so that's chapter 3. What I was disagreeing with is this sentence. Weltanschauung, with its statistical truths and her mixed population, finds it difficult to strike roots in a soil that is practically without history. Yeah, to a degree, but I think that the uniqueness of the United States is that our differences are what have made us strong. And so to the extent that we debate, and debate peacefully, not violently, we have made a country that is very strong. It's a process like tempering steel. And what has made us weak, and this is particularly true in the last 20 years, and much to Vladimir Putin's glee, is that we've allowed our political process to tear us apart in this neurotic way, which Dr. Jung obviously comments on from the perspective of a psychoanalyst, and what he points out is that we need someone who is able to see both sides of the equation in order to make a whole country. And just as we need a psychoanalyst who sees both the conscious and the unconscious, both sides of the personality, in order to make a whole person. And therefore, we certainly need politicians, be they more reddish or more bluish, who see the necessity of a connection between the two sides as the way forward, as the only way forward, because as long as we keep pulling apart the way we have been doing, inevitably we make our country weaker. And this is exactly what Vladimir Putin is hoping for. And so we're playing right into his hands when we allow this to continue. Now, I'm sorry that the chat has not been operating today properly, and I don't seem to be able to get it going again. I don't know why. And so as a result of that, and because I've finished this chapter, I'll now discontinue this presentation. Within the next couple of days, I'll try to read through a couple of more of these chapters. And so today I've been reading from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. And if you do have comments, I will make this video available very shortly, as soon as YouTube makes it available to me, and then you will be able to put your comments in the comment space underneath the video, so please watch for that. Thank you for joining me today.